About slavery, but few discuss paper genocide. We did not all come from Africa, and most of us have Aboriginal roots that were stripped away due to reclassification and miseducation. As a Native Black American and a member of the Muscogee Creek Nation, I understand the importance of tracing your lineage. If you want to learn how to trace your genealogy and apply for tribal citizenship, send an email to mike@keymediapro.com to schedule a consultation.
I am not a slave, I was born to slide, I am not afraid. Hop about the K, oh yeah, free to God, they went out of state. I'm a child of God, I do not belong to the United States. Fuck Black History, tell Uncle Sam he can catch a fade. I went to hell, I mean school, graduated at the top of my class. Still never thought I was over my peers. We did that time together 12 years. Ain't that some movie? I think that it is. They won't control me, I'm really a member. I traveled that road, I came back with the jewels from. When I pull up, they peep how the roof gone. We some dog killers, won't chew bones. Know we all spit on, we supreme. Somewhere I read a nigga had a dream.
You don't have to try to be something you're not.
God, I can't stand this. Trying to be something I'm not? Trying to be proud of my African heritage? If that's being something I'm not, then fine.
My grandmother was a full-blooded Iroquois. My grandfather was a black from a long line of journeymen who lived in Connecticut since the establishment of the colonies. My father was a Bajan who came to this country a cabin boy in a merchant marina.
I know all of that, Mama.
Then know this. I am alive because of the blood of a people who never scraped or begged or apologized for what they were. They asked only one thing of this world: to be allowed to be. I gave you my grandmother's name, a woman who bore 9 children and educated them all. Who held off 6 white men with a shotgun when they tried to drag one of her sons off to jail for not knowing his place. And you had to reach into an African dictionary to find a name that would make you proud.
I was born black, I live black, and I'm gonna die probably because some cracker that knows I'm black better than you, nigga, is probably gonna put a bullet in the back of my head.
This is the remix. My father was raised in the era when black niggas couldn't claim Native American. Making music would've thought I had help, but the Indians I know wanna be the chief they self.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, let me get some fists and feathers in the chat if you can hear me loud, crisp, and clear, and we'll go ahead and get this party started. Hit the Cash App or the PayPal if you support the mission. Hit the like button on the way in. And subscribe to the channel if you're new. I promise you will not regret it. In this live stream, I want to highlight a content creator who I've been shouting out a lot lately. I'll go ahead and post a link to his channel in the chat. UBTV. He's done a couple of great series. One is called America is Egypt. Another one is called Lost Tribe. And he really dives in pretty deep about the true Aboriginal roots of Black Americans. And you guys know that I'm a full-time genealogist. I help you guys discover your family heritage, go through the tribal citizenship process if that's something that you're interested in. So, you know, if I can highlight fellow content creators who are really putting in good work and not only sharing pertinent information, but putting it in a certain package that we can easily digest. I mean, this brother does great work. And, you know, he's somebody that I aspire to be more like as it relates to video production. When you guys see the level of attention that he really puts into his videos, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. But without further ado, let's take another deep dive into the true Aboriginal history of Black Americans.
One major detail missing from these early accounts of history is that these Europeans possessed guns and had been for at least 100 years. The world's oldest handguns were produced before the 1500s, and Europeans traded for gunpowder with Asia for over a century before Columbus even stepped foot in the Americas. The Spanish had been using handguns since 1356, yet no guns are pictured or mentioned in any of the art or literature from the early colonial period of the Americas. Are we to assume that Europeans only used firearms against other Europeans and not Black Americans? And this begs the bigger question. Without guns, would Europeans be extinct? When the first Europeans landed in the Americas, they only had one objective in mind. In 1452, Pope Nicholas signed Dum Diversas, declaring Rome's authority to subjugate any non-Christian into infinite slavery. Inter Caetera was signed in 1493 by Pope Alexander, father of Caesar Borgia. This papal bull permitted the families of Spain and Portugal first claim to all lands west and south of the Cape Verde Islands.
Yes, guys, if you guys are not familiar with Dum Diversas, actually, hold on. Let me not embarrass myself. Let me make sure I pronounce that correctly. Hold on, wait a minute. Yes, Dum Diversas. Guys, this was crazy. This was literally an act that the Pope put into action where they basically said, hey, anybody that's a non-Christian, they're a savage. You can enslave them, you can rape them, you can do whatever you want with them because they're not Christian. And they're also slaves forever. Why? Because by our guideline, by our Bible, by our religious doctrine, they are subhuman. They are less than. So you see how the European rationalizes committing genocide? You know, everybody has a heart, right? Everybody has a bit of a moral compass. So to get the Spaniards down with the get down, who weren't, you know, the Spaniards who are a little bit like, hold on, wait a minute. I mean, why do we have to go over to their land and kill them and steal their gold and stuff? Hold on. Well, the Pope had a plan. He said, hold on, by our law, by our God, by everything we believe in, those folks is not like us. They're not Christians, so they slaves. It's cool. Get over it. Oh, okay. Well, if the Pope says it's good, then we don't got to feel no kind of way about slaughtering them.
West and south of the Cape Verde Islands. Years later, the Spanish reign over the New World would come to an end after the defeat of the Spanish Armada at the hands of the British, led by Sir Francis Drake. On a voyage to the Americas, Drake was attacked by the Spaniards. From that point forward, Drake made it his personal mission to enact revenge against the Spanish. For the following years, he would successfully pirate, destroy, steal, and sink several Spanish vessels. He would deliver the restolen booty to Queen Elizabeth. For this, she was extremely grateful, as the Queen held opposition to the evil nature of Spanish colonialism. Drake was awarded with royal accommodation, and the Queen was excommunicated by Rome. With all of the cave-adjacent countries jockeying for claim of new Indian land, including France, the Netherlands, and even Sweden, the road was now paved for the British to become the dominant colonizers. After several failed attempts to colonize the East Coast, most notably the lost colony of North Carolina, who disappeared without a trace, the British would now send joint missions to the New World with a far more aggressive military strategy than ever before.
And actually, that colony that disappeared, vanished, I think they've even made some movies about that. I believe the colony was either the colony was called Roanoke, or the word that they found on the tree carved in was Roanoke. I'm not sure. I think the way the story goes is there was a tribe nearby. There was a people called the Roanoke. And when this British colony went missing, the only thing that they found no trace of the people, but they found carved into a tree the word Roanoke. Let me see. Let me make sure that I'm telling you guys the right thing. Yep, that's right. The Roanoke colony. Here we go. Yeah. It was going to be the first permanent English settlement in North America. The colony was founded in 1585, but when it was visited by a ship in 1590, the colonists had inexplicably disappeared. It has come to be known as the Lost Colony, and the fate of the 112 to 121 colonists remains unknown. Yeah. And this later leads to the colony of Virginia being formed. It gets deep, y'all. It gets deep. Here we go. This is actually how Virginia got its name, I believe. It says that Bancroft's description of the colonists, particularly White's infant granddaughter, Virginia Dare, cast them as foundational figures in American culture and captured the public imagination. So I believe the story goes that this girl, Virginia Dare, was the first one that was born in the colony. So that's why later on, when they have the colony of Virginia, they name it after this woman, I believe. But let me make sure that that I'm fact checking my damn self. Let me see. How did Virginia get its name? The state of Virginia. Oh no, you know what? It was named after Queen Elizabeth, matter of fact, Virgin Queen. Then why did I think that there was a tie with this chick? I guess the importance of this Virginia Dare is that she was the first child born in an American English colony. But coincidentally, they later on name another colony Virginia. It's supposed to be after the Queen, you don't say. Mike's not right all the time. But when I'm wrong, I'm right, because I could have been right. And right now I'm wrong, but I'm right. If you know, you know. But guys, let's keep on with the movie. I say the movie, really, it's a YouTube video, but every time UBTV drops a YouTube video, it's like a goddamn movie, I'm telling you. Make sure to go check out the brother's channel. Right now, I'm in his whole playlist, Lost Tribe, Lost at Home, actually. It's called Lost at Home. I thought it was called Lost Tribes. But this series is a great one, as well as his series on America as Egypt.
After the death of Queen Elizabeth, King James broke the large Virginia company into two competing companies. These companies were named Plymouth and London. These would be the first successful colonies that the British would ever found here in America. And this would change the course of history forever.
And you know what? I was still looking at some scenes behind the scenes because I'm like, I know I couldn't have been that far off. I know I didn't think that old girl was named Virginia was named after her for no reason. So guys, what it is I'm dyslexic, okay? I got it backwards. What it was is that girl Virginia Dare was named after the colony Virginia because she was the first child born in Virginia, whereas I thought the Virginia colony was named after her because she was the first child born there. Ah, I was close, guys. I was close. I have not lost all credibility with you. I hope. I hold myself to rigorous standards.
In 1682, Virginia would seek to eradicate these American Indians from the face of history with the Virginia Slave Act. In a term coined paper genocide, and with the arrival of African slaves to the Americas, the Virginia colony obtained an appeal to reclassify any conquered Native American under their jurisdiction into a Negro or other slave. Over time, the meaning of this word lost its context.
And actually, guys, this is something that you guys might want to take a screenshot of. I know the first time I saw this video, I took a screenshot. So this is the Virginia slave codes. As you can see, there's some very interesting things here. In the 1723 section, it's saying free Negro, mulatto, or Indian slaves. It says Negro, mulatto, or Indian. Also, definition of a mulatto given includes the child of an Indian. No Negro, mulatto, or Indian slave shall be set free. No free Negro, mulatto, or Indian whatsoever shall hereafter have any vote. So even the free ones don't get to vote. Okay. But one of the interesting laws that I found, check this one out. Hold on. Yeah, here we go. When we get to this one right here, let me see if I can pause it at the right time.
The Virginia Slave Act.
Oh, yes, here we go. So Virginia Slave Act, you see how it goes through the years and the different acts? Look at this one for 1670. Free Africans and Indians cannot purchase white servants, Christians, but can purchase from any of their own nation. So if you guys ever thought that it was just a conspiracy that there were free Black Indians, free Black slave masters, well, hey, this is the proof right here. Why would they make a law that free Africans and Indians can't purchase white slaves if there weren't African and Indian slave masters who were purchasing white slaves? Let's talk about it.
In a term coined paper genocide, and with the arrival of African slaves to the Americas, the Virginia colony obtained an appeal to reclassify any conquered Native American under their jurisdiction into a Negro or other slave. Over time, the meaning of this word lost its context.
And more specifically, what he was talking about there was in 1682, Virginia passed two acts that combined Native Americans and Africans into one category as Negroes and other slaves. So when we talk about the paper genocide, the racial reclassification, they've been reclassifying us way before the African American misnomer in 1988. They've been reclassifying us in 1682. Come on. The first United States Census was created in 1790. What does this mean? Well, if they were reclassifying us from Native Americans to Negro African slaves in 1682, that means they were reclassifying us for damn near 100 years before they even came out with the first U.S. Census. So you know that any racial demographic data is erroneous from the jump, from day one.
Of the African slaves shackled and shipped to America, the majority were male, brought for the specific purpose of breeding with indigenous women. The majority of male Black Indians were either killed or were too hostile to be taken as slaves.
Telling you your history and telling you what your history is and what it's not, and this and that. But it's refreshing to at least having a framework of what, your possible history is, especially like I say, growing up in being born in Worth County, that was used to be an Indian village. Indian post, and then learning that they for some reason, in the 1800s, people were removed. So I wouldn't know until I dig in deeper whether I'm, what side of them I'm on, through your consultation, where you kind of put some perspective to it. If it, like you said, if it was only 4% of Africans that was brought here to this land.
Male Black Indians were either killed or were too hostile to be taken as slaves, and usually got whipped and worked to death. But rarely ever did Indian males ever reproduce again. In 1705, Virginia passed into law the Virginia Slave Codes, which essentially was a staunch declaration of white supremacy. Through whatever means, free Blacks existed in Virginia at the time. These laws prohibited Blacks from owning firearms and allowed for the legal arrest of any Black suspected of being a runaway who could not provide documentation that he was free on sight. This law also did not allow any whites to work for Blacks. During this time, many poor European whites ventured to the New World in search of a better life, many working as indentured servants for a specific amount of time. Many of these Indians hired these whites to work in agriculture, especially tobacco, as it was becoming a huge cash crop in the Euro cave world. As westward expansion would continue, so would the wars between the indigenous Americans of old and the diseased destroyers of new. And just when you think these natives have had enough, here come the goddamn French. These pillagers from Paris forwent the coast of North America and instead snatched up areas of Canada along the St. Lawrence River in today what is known as Quebec, in addition to areas of Midland America as far south as the Louisiana Bayou. Although Hispaniola and the Taino people had already been conquered by the Spanish, the French now saw fit to take advantage of the waning Spanish stranglehold on the island. The French had begun to settle there after defeating the Spanish in a few small battles. The French took control of the western third of the island during the Treaty of Wiswick. France was given the power to rule that land under the authority of the Holy Roman Empire. In 1795, during the Peace of Basel, France was awarded the eastern half of Hispaniola in an exchange with Spain for a tiny slither of land in the western part of France called Chipusoka. What was the significance of this place, you may ask? It was the home of Ignacio de Loyola, the founder of the Society of Jesus.
Hold up, wait a minute now. Wait a minute. We got to pause the show. Pause the show. Somebody wants to teach us something new. I'm not even going to try to pronounce your name. I'm assuming you're most likely an African person or of African lineage. Thank you for joining. They say Tipu Tip. Mike, Google him. Biggest black slave owner in Kenya, Somalia, and Tanzania. Tipu Tip. I've never heard of Tipu Tip. I've heard of Madame Tinubu and several others, but never Tipu Tip. Let me see what's going on with Tipu Tip. He built a slave trading empire, it says. Wait a minute. Whoa. So for those Pan-Africans that want to say Africa's the motherland and all these white folks enslaved black folks and blase, nah, it's not called a mass invasion. It's not called a holy war. It's called a slave trade. Them Africans freely traded their fellow African for muskets, gunpowder, trinkets, really. So this guy, Tipu Tip, was an Afro, Amani, Ivory, and slave owner and trader, explorer, governor, and plantation owner. He worked for a succession of sultans of Zanzibar. Okay. He worked for a large and lucrative slave trade. Okay. He became the biggest and best known slave trader in Africa, supplying much of the world with enslaved Africans. Damn. Grimy. That's how them Africans get down. And again, it's not all Africans, but we can at least say that the ruling elite of Africa. The Africans that weren't down with the get down were the ones that were captured and trafficked to Brazil and the Caribbean, right? But yeah, this is very, very interesting. I urge you guys in your own time to take a look at Tipu Tip. I wonder why more of the Africans don't want to share their rich history of being slave owners, slave traders, building these complex slave trade networks that the Europeans then later took advantage of. Let's talk about it.
However, it would not be long before the French would lose control of the island. Newly imported African slaves, along with Aboriginal native Taino people who had been enslaved there since the days of Columbus, formed a revolution against the French. The natives defeated the French, committing Napoleon Bonaparte to a humiliating defeat at the hands of slaves. In 1804, Haiti claimed its independence from France. The French had been no less evil than the British or the Spanish. Taino and African people had been subjected to the worst conditions working on sugar plantations. It was even documented that pregnant women would abort their own children rather than to have them born into captivity. After years of complaints by abolitionist Europeans about the malicious treatment of slaves, the British passed the Slave Trade Act of 1789 and 1807, which restricted the number of slaves that could be transported within one vessel. Although this would seem more humanitarian in a sense, this law was in actuality passed to protect big business from insurance fraud. after the Zong massacre, in which 130 African slaves were massacred and or thrown overboard, the British would be the first invader Europeans to push for the abolishment of slavery. But of course, this idea wouldn't stick and would eventually evolve into various forms of capitalistic slavery that we still suffer from today. The Atlantic Ocean is the world's most massive slave graveyard. Beneath these waters rest an innumerable amount of souls, relinquishing their last breath of life into the treacherous, lonely abyss of the great deep.
And I think it is very important to note the Jewish involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. That is no conspiracy. That is a well-documented fact. Now, they like to misrepresent the numbers. They say, well, okay, there were Jewish slave masters, but the Jewish people only made up 1% of the slave masters. Okay, I'll give you that. Out of the slave masters, 1% of them were Jewish. But check out the figure they don't want to highlight. Out of the Jewish population in America, 25% of them were slave owners. So yes, out of all the slave owners, 1% of them are Jewish. But when you look at the Jewish community, 25% of the Jewish people are participating in the transatlantic slave trade in one form or fashion or another. Again, I'm the king of receipts, so I'm not just going to talk about it. Let me cite a source. The transatlantic slave trade and the Dutch and Jewish involvement. Guys, when we talk about Jewish, Jews, Jewish people are multi-ethnic people. There's Russian Jews, there's Dutch Jews, there's Irish Jews, there's Spanish Jews. They say that Cristobal Colon, who the British later called Christopher Columbus, but Cristobal Colon had Jewish ancestry. But let's read a little bit. It says the Atlantic slave trade or transatlantic slave trade that took part from the 16th to the 19th century transported about 12 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to North and South America. This makes it the biggest forced migration in history. The majority of enslaved people were sold by Africans from central and western parts of Africa to European slave traders who shipped them to the New World. And again, when we present a source to the court of public opinion, we've got to cite our source. As you can see here, I'm reading an article from jewishmuseum.org.uk. The main European trading countries were Portugal, the United Kingdom, France, Spain, and the Netherlands. The Dutch first participated in the transatlantic slavery in the 1630s by transporting slaves to Brazil. Following that, the Netherlands also got involved in the slave trade to the Spanish colonies. In the 18th century, the country's most important slavery markets were what are today Suriname and Guyana. Initially, the Dutch trade was organized by the so-called Dutch West Indies Company. But after 1730, an era of free trade developed. The Dutch part in the transatlantic slave trade is estimated at 5 to 7%. This means that about 550,000 to 600,000 Africans were deported by the Netherlands. Dutch Orthodox Rabbi Lodi van de Kamp, guys, we cite our sources around here. We have a Dutch Orthodox Rabbi. Orthodox Rabbi means Jewish. I know some of you guys may not be familiar with the terms, but basically this is a Dutch Jewish person who wrote a book about Dutch Jewish complicity in the transatlantic slave trade. He talks about the Jonansave Jewish savannah, an agricultural community with 40 Jewish-owned plantations, with at least 5,000 enslaved people in a part of former Dutch Guyana. Seymour Dreschker, a historian at the University of Pittsburgh, states that Dutch Jews may have accounted for the resale of at least 15,000 enslaved people on the Caribbean island of Curacao. So, guys, when I said that the Jewish folks made up 1% of the slave masters, but 25% of the Jewish population participated in the slave trade. I was talking about it in America specifically, like running plantations in America. As you can see, there was another sect of Jews called the Dutch Jews who were enslaving people in the Caribbean. Come on. According to Dreschker, there was a time when Jewish people controlled about 17% of the Caribbean trade in Dutch colonies. And you guys don't understand how large of a percentage that is, because when they say over 12 million African slaves were trafficked, over 40% of them went to the Caribbean. Millions went to the Caribbean. Over 60% went to South America, Brazil. Millions went to Brazil. So when they say that the Jewish folks owned or controlled 17% of the Caribbean trade in the Dutch colonies, that's a big, big, big number. Wait a minute. However, Jewish involvement in transatlantic slavery is not unique, as wealthy merchants across Europe and different faiths all participated. And that's right. We're not singling out the Jewish people. Dutch people participated. Spanish people participated. All different kinds of Europeans participated. But a lot of people conveniently want to leave out the Jewish participation. And guess what? They also leave out the Jewish overlap. Because while the Spaniards participated and the Dutch participated and the British participated, well, there were Spanish Jews participating on the Spaniard side, and there were Dutch Jews participating on the Dutch side, and there was Jews in Britain participating on that side. So either way you slice it, guys, they want us to think it was some grand conspiracy that the Jewish people had any involvement, but now you see in a book written by a Dutch Jewish rabbi, they admit it. Do you see how important it is citing your sources, showing the receipts instead of just talking?
When invaders arrived to the Americas and started conquering Indians, any native who did not submit to the crown and the Pope was either tortured and killed or taken into slavery. And as a result, the majority of the slaves taken from North America were sold in Europe, Asia, and Africa. It was no secret that the conquistadors came looking for resources, spoils, and riches. Rumors of El Dorado, the great golden city, triggered a swell of infectious Gentiles crowding into boats and sailing to Zion. Most, if not all, invaders came up fruitless in their pursuit of gold. Rather than returning to Europe empty-handed, human cargo was packed into these vessels to be shipped and sold in Europe. The first slave trade in American history occurred between the Americas and Europe. Whenever Europeans traveled to the Americas, they returned with slaves. Europeans made thousands of trips to America from 1492 until 1859. Are we to assume that in 367 years, Europeans did not extract Black Americans and sell them in Europe? It was often reported that DeSoto had more slaves than soldiers. Those slaves were Black Indians. Are we to assume that after those battles and collecting slaves, the conquistadors freed these captives and went back to Europe with nothing of value to trade or sell? What was the real reason for intermingling African male slaves into the indigenous population?
I think it was very informative, very educational, very knowledgeable, because you touched on some things that I was aware of, but I wasn't aware in detail. So it kind of gives like an insight to some of the things that are going on today from history. So I think it's very important to learn your genealogy. And I thank you for the information. You're showing us how to navigate through the system. It's worth 75 or maybe a little bit more to me.
Africans were brought to replenish the dwindling slave numbers after genocide, massacre, and disease nearly wiped out the entire indigenous population. All records indicate that the majority of the African slave trade was carried out under the control of the British, precisely after the Virginia Slave Act and the Virginia Slave Codes. The bulk of African slaves shipped from Africa to America occurred between 1690 and 1800. According to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World. 10.7 survived. 14% of those died in the Middle Passage.
Most of them went to the Caribbean and South America. The smallest percentage of African slaves came to the 13 colonies. But they want us to believe that every single Black American is a descendant of a West African slave. That's logistically impossible. I've seen the lowest numbers I've seen quoted is some historians say that only 90,000 African slaves came to the 13 colonies. Some historians say as much as 300,000 slaves came over. But let's play devil's advocate. Let's say 300,000 African slaves came over here to North America. The math still ain't mathing. We got over 42 million Black Americans present day. You don't take a sample population of 300,000 people and have them multiply into over 42 million people, whether it's been 300 years, 600 years, or 900 years. That's logistically impossible. The birth rate does not support those figures. But this is where people say, well, no, Mike, they say that they were breeding the slaves on the plantation, right? Okay, well, the average life expectancy of a plantation slave was 21 to 31 years old. So how many babies are you having before you die at the old age of 21 to 31? Furthermore, back then, they were, malnutrition, bad living conditions, mistreated. Hygiene was so bad in those days that even white women had to have about a dozen children because they knew that if you were going to die at childbirth or not even make it past age 3, but they want us to think that we were just multiplying like jackrabbits. No, the birth rate does not support those figures.
Of those 10.7 million slaves shipped from Africa, only 388,000 made it to North America, as South America received 95% of total Africans shipped, with Brazil receiving the most. This fact isn't even negated by the charlatan false witness Henry Louis Gates Jr. During the American Revolution and thereafter, slave numbers nearly doubled by 1810, but the British signed the Slave Trade Act in 1787 and stopped shipping Africans by 1808. So where did all these new slaves come from? Less than 400,000 landed in America in the span of 367 years. Yet the slave population jumps by 400,000 in the span of 20 years. Women could not reproduce effectively under the stress of lifelong servitude. Most women carried their child until moments before conception, all while slaving her life away in the field. Where did this dramatic jump in population come from? Considering the supposed British abolishment of the African slave trade, low life expectancy, and recessive birth rate amongst slaves, one would think that the overall population would surely drop. But that would not be the case, because in 1860, the slave population had exploded to over 4 million in the United States, yet a new African slave had not legally stepped foot in the United States in over 50 years.
This is called paper genocide. This is called reclassification. If the slave trade was already abolished, there's no more new slaves coming in, then how does the population of the slaves grow so drastically year over year? Oh, we got a new batch of Indians we've reclassified as Negro. That's what it is.
In the 1770s, the British recruited slaves to fight in the Revolutionary War. Even George Washington's personal slaves fought. Lord Dunmore, Virginia royal governor, proclaimed to all slaves willing to bear arms for Britain that they would be granted freedom. The slave soldiers wore uniforms with a cryptic message embroidered upon them: liberty to slaves. Ironically, after the war, the British promptly abandoned their black soldiers and they were ordered to return back into perpetual servitude. A very small amount of those black soldiers were actually able to get escorted to Canada, where they were likely able to find passage to England.
You guys see how important having a clear understanding of history is? I don't blame you if during school you didn't really pay attention in history class. History class didn't really resonate with you. They was teaching us a bunch of bullshit, no matter why. No matter why we never really vibed with what they was teaching us. We knew deep in our DNA it was some bullshit. But when we get into the truth here, when we get into the real circumstances that led to the situation that we're now faced with, well, God damn it, isn't this something that you just can't get enough of?
Plantation conditions were beyond treacherous. Between sugar plantations in the Caribbean, rice plantations in South Carolina, cotton plantations in Alabama, tobacco plantations in Virginia, the average life expectancy of a slave was less than 24 years old. And over half of all children born died at birth or shortly thereafter. So how could a slave population grow with a negative birth rate? no Africans were brought as slaves legally after 1810. Did the government smuggle 3 million secret Africans in less than 50 years? Or were indigenous natives captured and taken by colonizers and sold into slavery, only to be later reclassified as African? During this time of mass growth of industry, also came the influx of new Indian slaves to all these southern plantations at the hands of men like Andrew Jackson. A notorious killer of Indians, Jackson was said to chop down women and children with a bloody axe just because he enjoyed it. Jackson was also a wealthy slave owner himself and represented both the rich and common white man. These Southerners wanted to push all Indians by force out of the remaining territories they still inhabited. Harboring a severe hatred for Indians, Jackson and Southern whites pushed legislation to pass the Indian Removal Act.
Evening, I had a consultation, a genealogy consultation to figure out my Native American ancestry. And I was given a lot of valuable information this evening, from the origin of the tribes to the different ethnic breakdown to how everything was ran and colonized before, the discovery of Columbus, and after he came over here. So I think that you will find the value in the information as I did.
For joining up to fight against the Indians, Jackson promised to reward any poor white with regentrified Indian land. Jackson's men would lead militias into Indian territory and forcibly push Indians off their land with an army. To resist meant horrific death. To comply meant slavery, or possible starvation, then sickness, then death on the road to the Oklahoma reservation in the dead of winter. Indians were charged money to cross rivers. Many perished on the banks of the Mississippi because they could not afford the $1 to $3 per head price gouge by ferry attendants when whites were being charged a nickel. Many of these people would choose to be indentured servants. Out of desperation for survival, they would sign themselves up as slaves. With fugitive slave laws and the Virginia codes, many indigenous natives and free blacks were simply kidnapped into slavery. Chattel slavery is possibly one of the most inhumane forms of servitude. It implies that a slave is no more valuable than a head of cattle. This was the form of slavery that American Black Indians had to endure, worked to death in the hot, muggy heat of the Southeast United States, captive on their own land, tilling the earth, breaking their back for their oppressor and master. The slave trade was extremely profitable for both areas of the country, North and South. Southern plantations had the highest concentration of American black slaves, and as a result of this free labor, the U.S. was now the world's #1 cotton exporter. This didn't just mean Southern whites got rich, but Northern whites as well. The North was able to build industry around slavery, including, but not limited to, banking, insurance, transportations, manufacturing, and textiles. By 1900, the U.S. had become a dominant world power, built off the backs of the true Americans.
Shout out to Melanin Runs Through My Veins. She says, this is my first time hearing of volunteer slavery. This is wild. In my findings, I've learned that while our ancestors may have been classified as freedmen or indentured servants or slaves, oftentimes it was very similar to modern day employment. What's the difference between an employee and a slave? Oh, we now in recent years have employment at will. Okay. But imagine employment where you're doing manual labor and you live on company property, and just like any job, you can have a great boss or you can have an asshole boss, and you can deal with it and put up with it because you don't think you got other opportunities, or you can say, fuck this shit and bounce. So, you know, in certain British colonies at certain points of time, it was some crazy, egregious, you know, killing and hanging and all this crazy stuff. But for the vast majority, it was not going on like that. When they did turn up the heat on us, we rebelled. The Massa and his whole family was killed in the middle of the night. Plantation burned down. There was many Indian revolts, Indian wars. Besides the Seminole Wars, there was so many successful rebellions they don't tell you about. They just want us to know about Nat Turner. But no, we was tearing shit up if they treated us a certain way. So, yeah, you'll find that oftentimes we were reclassified, relocated, and then, like he said, on the way to the Trail of Tears, we're starving, we're hungry. Well, if we come across a plantation that says, hey, we got 3 hots and a cot, just work for us. You know, you may call this slavery. You may call it sharecropping. You may call it indentured servitude. Our ancestors called it life.
They don't want you to remember this. You not no slave, you indigenous. Fuck how they painted them Indians. You went to war with the French and the British men. Quite frankly, you was kings, Merovingians. They took the women and men, made them prisoners. Raised up the children to worship their images. Set up a lab to the genes and they mixed them. And this shit get way deeper than your pigment.